So here we go, folks. Kate, I mean, is it me, or is it something that we are seeing here, that the GMs, they look omnipotent. They don't answer any questions unless they want to. And the only people who seem to get fired are coaches, and then we attack players. But the GMs are considered geniuses until they win. Thoughts?
Yeah, look, man. I gotta stand up for my front office people across all sports. Who are you, Howard Bryant, to come for the job security of these brave men and women who have to have a vision, right? Oh, everyone loves the coaches because everyone loves flying by the seat of their pants. I hate him. I love him. I love her. I hate her. Bring me that one. Straight away that one. It's easy to play what was it, King Joffrey on Game of Thrones, and everything is a whim. But the reality is, in order for this thing to work, the venture of a professional sports franchise having to build towards winning a championship, you need people in place who have vision and who have a plan and who have a way of executing that vision and plan, and knowing how all the pieces fit and knowing that it doesn't happen overnight.
Mm-hmm.
If we had GMs on the same life expectancy as coaches, then all we would have is people who are adjusting endlessly without ever letting the adjustments carry themselves out. When I was learning how to drive, my father taught me a very important thing. He said, when you're driving, don't stare at the nose of the car. Pick a point off in the distance, the car in front of you, just anything other than the nose of the car. Because what happens if you're driving, you stare at the nose of the car, you'll do this. You'll be moving the steering a little bit left, a little bit right, a little right, and you'll end up zigzagging because you are so focused on the here and now, you're adjusting to everything.
How many things did you crash into?
Well, I mean, I did it for like 5 seconds and I realized he was right. When I throw my point of vision off in front of me, the car in front of me, a little bit in front of me, then all of a sudden you drive straight and you're not doing all these little mini adjustments. You know what you're doing. And so it makes no sense to me to argue that GMs, or I like to call them in basketball, chief basketball decision makers, because there's a part in your essay there that I do agree with, this whole idea of I'm in charge, but I don't actually do the day-to-day stuff. Someone else does that. That's a different conversation. But whoever's making these decisions, you can't have them operating with the idea that if this doesn't work out, I'm going to get fired every little move they do, because otherwise then we'll have no direction. And I submit to you, every organization that has a lot of turnover in its front office, like, I don't know, the New York Knickerbockers, what follows beyond it is just a lot of disaster.
Oh, okay. I mean, I do. Well, one, I mean, have you previously used this learning to drive analogy when describing NBA franchises? Or are you trotting this out for the first time?
No. This is an oldie but a goodie. This is coming straight out of the Carrot Top box of props.
I do see your point when it comes to needing longevity in the front office to not just be reacting to the whims of the day. I do wonder what you think about this. I do wonder what you think about how the GM position has shifted over the last 15 years, because my experience, like when I was covering the Sixers, the GM, when I first started as the beat writer for the Sixers, was Mr. Ed Stefanski. And he was a prominent character in the Sixers story. It was at that time, right? Mo Cheeks was the head coach. Ed Stefanski, Andre Iguodala was the foundational player, and Ed Stefanski was as big of a character as Mo Cheeks, and it led to the media coverage of those particular Sixers, including yours truly covering them, to focus on Ed Stefanski as much, if not more, than we were focusing on Mo Cheeks and the roster. And I would posit to you, and I think this is part of what Howard was talking about in the essay, was that it seems as if general managers realize positioning themselves alongside the coaches and becoming central characters in the story of their team they realized that wasn't the best move for their career longevity. And that has taken a shift over the last 15 years, because I don't see, and I'm not as day to day with the Sixers at this point, but I don't see like Elton Brand as general manager positioning himself in the same way that the GMs were back in like 08, 09. You're on mute.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things going on. Once upon a time, the guy who had the power was the coach. And the GM was just the guy to make those things happen. As time went on, we began to realize that there needed to be an importance and hierarchy between GM and the coach, because the GM was making these massive strategic decisions and the coach was just executing. So really, GM is the guy in power, not the coach. And as that grew, then the importance of the GM to be up front grew. And now we've kind of gone back around where we have a lot of these guys who aren't necessarily basketball guys by trade. They want to recede back into the background again. Still have the power, but not have any of the accountability. Great example of this is, once again, the New York Knicks, Leon Rose. Leon Rose has met with the media exactly one time since he's been hired. He's had a couple of like curated state propaganda TV appearances on MSG. But as far as I'm meeting media people and answering their questions, the guy's had exactly one since he took over. Now, that's in stark contrast to Philadelphia, where you're right, Umbrella's the GM, but Daryl Morey is the chief basketball decision maker. And Daryl is very available. Bob Myers in Golden State is very available. Pat Riley in Miami is very available. So it varies. I would say we're half and half in this league. Half of our league are guys that are okay with being out front. James Jones in Phoenix is another great example. Danny Ainge up in Utah. These guys are okay with being out front. Now, in many of these cases, they also have someone who answers to them who's doing a lot of the grunt work, right? For Pat Riley, it's Andy Ellisberg. For Daryl Morey, it's Elton Brand. For Danny Ainge, it's Justin Zanuck. And all those guys have the title of GM, but obviously they don't have the ultimate decision-making power. But then you've got guys like Leon Rose, who just kind of fade in the background. Don't mind me. I'm just a guy. And I think that's a phenomenon that's born out of, I think, the business world people who have crossed over to this, and they don't want to have that accountability, that day-to-day accountability that is, so commonplace in the rest of sports.
Well, you've got a couple things at work here, right? And you're both 100% right on this, as times have shifted. And to Amin's point, when times shifted about the coach having the control, when you go back, it wasn't just that the coach had control over the X's and O's. The coach also had control in terms of longevity. Coaches lasted longer in the 60s and the 70s than they do now. Coaches get a year. They get 2 years. They might get 2 years. And now we have a phenomenon that used to virtually never happen. You get fired after making the playoffs. Mm-hmm. You can get fired after winning championships now, if you're a coach. They'll get rid of, so success is no longer the barometer for your stability. And that's a very new thing. That's a 20-year phenomenon at best, because it once was that if you had made the playoffs, you weren't losing your job. The organization, you were central to the organization. And now, today, the GM is the person who is most in control because of that long-term planning that you're talking about. However, and I will submit to you, Sandy Alderson, 2004. He is the general manager at that time. I think Sandy was either working for Major League Baseball. I don't think he was with the Padres. I think he was at Major League Baseball at the time in 2004. He had already left the A's, and he was telling me a story about when Tony La Russa left Oakland and went to St. Louis, and now the Oakland A's have a managerial opening. And it was Sandy, even before Billy Beane, who was asking the question. And he said, for 150 years, the power of the front office was with the manager.
Mm-hmm.
So if the organizational philosophy of the organization was with the manager. So when you change that position, which is essentially a mid-management position,
mm-hmm.
every time you change the middle manager, the entire organizational philosophy has to shift.
Mm-hmm.
That's bullshit. We're not doing that anymore.
Mm-hmm.
We draft these players to play a certain style. So just because we get rid of this one position, our entire last 3 drafts no longer fit with what we're trying to do as an organization. And so
it's back to the car analogy.
It's back to the car analogy,
know,
which,
know?
by the way, on a podcast, people can't see the ridiculous car driving wheel motion that you're making. The visual prompt, yes. And so Sandy's point is exactly to your point. And, when they finally did hire Art Howe, Sandy said to Art, just so you know, we're not hiring you for your philosophy. We're hiring you to make sure you fit ours. And that has been the fundamental shift in baseball and probably in most of the sports of the last 25, 30 years.
Yeah. Well, what do you think about this? So this idea of middle management, and it's tough to label GMs as middle management because I think of like corporate America, middle managers.
Well, the coach is the middle manager in this one.
Yeah.
Right. But even insinuating in sports that there is such a thing as middle management bureaucracy feels like a new. What are you reacting to, Amin?
1,000%. It's all bureaucracy,
and it's all relatively brand new.
That's what I mean. This bureaucracy feels like an invention of the last generation.
It's part of the Moneyball generation. Absolutely. I think
it goes beyond Moneyball, because I go back to Pat Riley in New York and going upstairs, breaking chain of management, skipping over his GM, Ernie Grunfeld, his president, Dave Checkers, and going straight to ownership saying, in order for me to continue coaching the Knicks, I need to be in charge of all personnel, and I need ownership. I need an ownership stake, which, of course, he knew they would say no to because he had it lined up and waiting for him in Miami. Goes down to Miami, faxes his resignation to the Knicks. Mm-hmm. That dynamic has been around, I want to say, at least 30 years.
Yeah.
Right? Phil Jackson and Jerry Krause is another example. Of Jerry Krause being Phil Jackson's boss, even though Phil Jackson had the power and had the adoration of not only any locker room, but the locker room that had the greatest player of all time, and 6 championships to boot. And yet, he could not survive the office politics and the bureaucracy of Jerry Krause going to Jerry Reinsdorf and saying, nah, we're done with him. Another example of that usurping and that skipping over was what Phil Jackson did in L.A., basically weeding Jerry West out of a position that he'd had for 25 years or so. So I know now with Moneyball and with the influx of these Wall Street types and all that, it's become a little bit more defined and it looks a lot more like corporate America than it ever has. Many of these dynamics have existed at least since the 90s.
Yes, no doubt about that. I think that the difference has been, I think it's the difference in the sports. And I think in basketball, you're 100% right. I think in baseball, it's taken a little bit longer. It took until the early 90s, the mid 90s, which is when this is the time period I'm discussing. And of course, Moneyball got a name in the early 2000s.
Right.
But the dynamic, I think one of the reasons why it took a little bit longer in baseball instead of basketball is because the outsized nature of the manager in baseball is famous. The Billy Martins and the Tony La Russas and the Tommy Lasordas and the rest of them. That position was as famous as any management position in sports. The baseball manager, right? This guy, Connie Mack owned the team, but he was there for 50 years, in that same position. Mm-hmm. And I think you're right. And in basketball, you didn't have that same dynamic in Boston, obviously, but Red Auerbach was the anchor, the GM position at that organization for forever up until Dave Gavitt took over. So 100%. But what I'm really also getting at here, it's not just who's in control. It's also who is the front-facing person. Just because you have to have a vision, and just because you're not looking at the front, the nose of the car, doesn't mean that you can't answer questions. Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean that you don't have to be accountable. And that's the real dynamic of this that I see. I'm looking at this and I'm not thinking just, okay, well, I'm not suggesting that you're supposed to say, let's just take everything year by year and see how these teams go. I'm talking about how when you're talking about jobs and when you're talking about security, not all these guys have a vision that works. They are less accountable than ever. And part of me thinks that that is part and parcel with a lot of what's happening in this country. Yeah. The powerful people are more and more and more insulated than we've seen before.
And why is that? Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Kate.
Well, I was going to add on to what Howard said. It was one of the things Howard and I were talking about offline was that if we're looking at the NBA in particular, what seems to have happened over the last 20 years is reflected in what we often see in politics, which is people who have power. And if the levers of staying in power are open to them to pull, then of course they're pulling them, which we see all the time of like whatever political party is in power and they realize, oh, they can make up the lines of the district for the re-election. There is a part of this concept that we're talking about right now when it comes to sports where what it seems like what is happening is building a deeper thicket of surrounding sports world, which is making it more difficult to get to the word Howard used, accountability, is part of what has happened in the NBA, which is, okay, well, if I'm in power and I can create a structure that will allow me to stay in power for longer, even if it is because I have the vision and I'm looking out farther over the nose of the car, well, of course, I'm going to, inside of my franchise structure, build that out so that I can remain in power for longer.
And also, I mean, does that actually mean having that insulation? Does that mean that you actually have stability? It's not like you haven't had GMs and you haven't had organizations that have had people in place for a very long time that still didn't win.
Yeah, okay, so at this point, I feel like I should put the disclaimer, just because that's the way the position is doesn't mean there aren't people who are garbage at it. There's always going to be people who are bad at it and don't deserve to have that sort of job security. I'm not talking about them. I'm talking about in general, right? So you said people in power seem to have a longevity, right? Why is that?
Well, I mean, Howard, I was going to say, well, I guess the theory on the table here is that GMs realized, many of them, not all of them, if instead of being central characters in the story of their team, open to the media frequently, and then therefore up for criticism if the team isn't going well, that the theory on the table is like, actually a better strategy would be to remove myself from that ecosystem, create more infrastructure in terms of who actually is accountable at the end of the day if this team has a stretch where they aren't performing as well. Well, if there's more infrastructure, we have more people in the front office, there's more layering between me and the public, well, then that serves the purpose of having a longer term to install my vision.
That's part of it. That's more the how than the why. You're absolutely right. All that's correct. That's more of a how. Howard, why is that? Why is it the people in power seem to have longevity?
I get the sense that Amin knows the answer, and he's just
Amin believes that you. I mean, tell us what you believe this answer is. Let's just hear it.
Proximity to the money.
Yeah, to owner.
To the money.
That's right.
In politics, it's to corporate America and the lobbyists that fund basically your entire campaign.
Yeah,
if I keep the NRA happy, then as a certain political representative of a party, that's going to ensure that I'm not going to lose my district. Because the NRA is going to do everything they can to help me in my quest to keep this seat. And in return, obviously, I placate them. I keep them happy. On the sports level, that is the owner. And that's why I say the number one goal, the number one, the best thing any general manager or chief decision maker can have, the number one ability is the ability to manage up. I don't care if you don't know how to scout, you don't know the salary cap, you don't get along with players, you don't get along with coaches. If you keep that person up there happy, you are going to keep your job.
Yes,
and theoretically, I should be keeping them happy by doing my job well. But the reality is, as is many things with unintended consequences, oftentimes you don't need to do that hard stuff of actually being good at your job. There's a lot easier way by being like, oh, gosh, shucks, kind of great. Get along with the guy, speak his language, make him feel good or make her feel good about the where we're going as an organization and what we like to do and keep them involved in this, what is ostensibly a toy, and you will keep your job forever.
Yes, my answer to you was going to be that you have a vested interest in the money as well, because if we're really talking about this position historically, you can go back into the 20s and the 30s and the 40s, go back to Branch Rickey when he was managing the Cardinals, go back to Branch Rickey when he was the president of the Dodgers. And when I say managing, I meant general manager, where Branch Rickey got a percentage of the profits. He wasn't necessarily always part of the owner class, even though he did have a stake in the team. Mm-hmm. A lot of general managers, even in the 60s and 70s and the 80s, when the team turns a profit, they get money for it. That's part of their bonus. And so therefore, it begs the question, what constitutes victory? And this is the reason why when I talk to people all the time about, I talk to regular sports fans and I say, look, if you think winning comes first to a sports team, you're crazy. If you're lucky, winning is fourth at best.
Right.
And more than that, winning oftentimes, because sometimes you can win and make money, right?
Yes.
Sometimes winning and making money are completely untethered concepts. And then sometimes it's either win or make money. And that's the big one. Sports is the only business in the world where we have a second objective other than making money, right? At Coca-Cola, it's like, hey, man, like, did we we increase our profit margins, increase our market share? All of it is bottom line stuff. They don't care about winning the Clio Award for the most creative advertising. It's nice, don't get me wrong. They enjoy having those kind of but that's just like, those are trinkets that are so not even close to the concept of our bottom line. In sports, I would argue, like Howard would, that the bottom line still is number one, but at least that winning part is a worthy number two. In regular business, that doesn't exist. So what ends up happening, I'll give you a good example. I work for the Phoenix Suns, and there are two rules I know in the NBA right now that exist because of what we did when I was there. I'm not saying it was my idea. I was there when it happened. Number one, the NBA changed the rule. It used to be whenever you made a transaction with another team, you could throw in, or they could throw in, $3 million in cash just to sweeten the deal, right? And so what ended up happening was we would get to the draft, we would have first-round picks, and we would basically call up usually Portland and say, hey, we'll trade you our first-round pick if you take this bad contract off of our hands and also throw in $3 million in cash for us. And Paul Allen, who was a billionaire and loved draft day more than any other day of the year, just loved the action, would be like, do it. And so there were years we were making $15 million a year in revenue, straight up just of all of people throwing $3 million in for us doing these transactions. And what ended up happening is the league changed the rule, made it so now you can make a total, or you can either take or receive a total of $7 million in a calendar year, in a fiscal year. Meaning you can't just throw in $3 million. At the $7 million mark, it's done. You're done doing cash transactions. The other rule was, hey, what's the minimum amount of people you need to have on your roster? 13. What happens if we go under 13, if we go down to 12? Well, they fine you, or they give you 2 weeks to fill that 13th spot. And after that, they fine you. So what we ended up doing was, once we get to 10-day season, we go down to 12, we wait 2 weeks, then we sign a guy for 10 days. And at the end of his 10 days, we let him go. And then we go another 2 weeks with 12 on a roster. And then at the end of that, we sign him again for another 10 days. Now, if you sign
that's very pro-labor.
I'm just saying, like, this was our way of, while competing for a championship, we're one of the best teams in the league, also caring about the bottom line in a way that one would imagine a team so close to a championship would not care about the bottom line like that.
Yeah.
That's right.
Okay. This is both a detour and also a callback to an earlier episode where, I don't know if you two remember, but I had never seen The Godfather.
Still,
have you seen it yet?
Still haunts me.
Yes.
Still haunts it. You have?
Yes.
You've seen it.
I'll tell you why.
In the silence for James Caan.
And the reason I bring this up is because, I mean, you were saying like sports is basically the only business, and it made me think that one other one that runs parallel to it is the movie business, where
I thought you were going to say organized crime.
Me too. I was like, where is this going?
Maybe
it's gone gangster.
Maybe because and the reason I bring this up is because the reason I saw The Godfather was because I watched the Paramount Plus show The Offer about the making of The Godfather and the producer who helped put it together, and basically, aside from the mafia trying to shut it down repeatedly and Frank Sinatra getting involved, one of the biggest hurdles was consistently, and this is obviously exists across movies, is like Francis Ford Coppola wanting to shoot in Sicily because it was imperative to the quality and the veracity of the movie, but then they don't have that $25,000. And like, I think there are distinct parallels between the ostensible goals of both sports and movies, like to make great films but then really
once again, the definition of winning is
but also
making a good
Godfather
quality movie.
Really good, y'all. Like there's a reason people love that movie. I gotta say,
let the record show 50
good.
years later, Kate Fagan endorses The Godfather as a
That's
film.
Right.
Better late than never. Better late than never. Never forget that.
Here's the difference, Kate. I would say, oh, you know what? You're right. It is the same. Because I was going to say the director, in this case, Francis Ford Coppola, he's the coach. So he's saying, I
need this player.
I need Sicily on my team. I can't do it with Hollywood backlot. I need Sicily. And the owners or the producers are like,
and the studio
costs too much money.
Yeah, the studio, right.
Sicily costs too much money. It's all we can afford is this mid-level exception of a Hollywood backlot. So yeah, I guess that is a good comp.
Outstanding comp. And I'm very proud of you, Kate Fagan, because it's important that you have seen this movie.
I agree now. And
it's
what's
culturally important to know.
Yeah. And what's on the table now is people believe The Godfather Part 2 is even better than Part 1. And so I have that to look forward to.
48 years later.
Yeah.
48 years later, Kate Fagan acknowledges that there's a chance that the second greatest movie of all time is actually better than the first greatest movie of all time.
Oh, wait, Howard, are you a Godfather 1 over 2 person?
I'm a Godfather 2 over 1.
Oh, okay. All right. There you go.
Okay. All right, Howard, it's up to you to attempt to get us back on track here.
You know what? I'm happy on the track that we're on, but yes, I will go in keeping in line with the what constitutes winning conversation here, which is what we're really talking about. And to go on with this, when I say I talk to fans and I say it comes forth, people say, really, well, what comes ahead of winning? Obviously, the revenues come ahead of winning. Number 2, player control is far more important than winning. I mean, you could, especially in baseball, where you can control a guy for 6 years. So absolutely, player control is a big. Guys will get rid of, like the Oakland A's were getting rid of guys 2 years before their contracts were up, just to have control and not have to face their arbitration or face their free agency. And then, of course, the third thing is actual stadium control. Guys are fighting over the revenues that come with the stadiums. And then fourth is, what's the product on the field? What's in the standings? Where are we in the standings? If you are lucky, and I think the fans of the Golden State Warriors have been lucky in that they have an organization where they don't want winning to come fourth. Of course, they did build a brand new stadium in San Francisco during this time, but these are the considerations. And people want to be much more romantic about it when it comes to the winning and losing, as if sport, winning is the only thing. That Vince Lombardi stuff does not play. So so what I was going to say on this was that, because of that, you sort of have to acknowledge the dynamic, and it changes the coach general manager dynamic as well, because they've got two different missions. They may actually have somewhat of an adversarial relationship, because one has to win now and the other one, as Amin said, has got time to implement a vision.
I guess one of the questions too that we're trying to parse here is, does this added bureaucracy, I guess that's what we're kind of calling where we're at now with sports. If we're saying over the last 30, 40 years, debatable. Does this added bureaucracy, what level of the goals does it serve? Because it doesn't appear to serve the winning goal, or maybe you think it does, whereas it serves maybe individual goals more.
Well, the need for the bureaucracy has also grown. This is something we didn't talk about why. Why do we need so much bigger front offices than we did in the 80s and 70s across all sports? And I would point to 1983, the invention of the salary cap. Prior to 83, there was no cap in sports. You paid guys what you thought they were worth. You paid what you could afford, right? And with the introduction of the salary cap, made collective bargaining a lot more complicated, right? And so, Howard,
the cap was 85, wasn't it?
They agreed to it in 83.
83, yeah. Implemented 85.
So what ends up happening is we now have salary caps in 3 of the 4 major sports, and baseball has revenue share and luxury tax, some quasi cap, I guess. But what it does is it's made it way more complex to say, okay, I'm just picking him, and him, and that's my team, or her, and her. Like, there's so much more to it. It demands a lot more of an understanding than just who can play and who can't, and how much money do I have in my pocket as an organization. So that requires more specialization and more manpower to be able to keep up with all these things. The other thing is also, with the explosion of all of these sports across the globe and the growth in information available to us, that also needs a lot more bodies, a lot more labor in order to process that information that is now coming to us from China, from the Cameroon, from Finland. It's all over. From Australia. You've got more information in general, and then more information coming from more different places. That all requires, I believe, A, more people, and B, people with a different skill set than run high pick and roll and trap them on the sideline.
Well, the job isn't just the job anymore. It's exactly right. When you're looking at what we're actually talking about, the GM used to actually sign players and trade them, and now the assistant GM is doing all the contracts. That the assistant GM, those guys aren't even part of it anymore. And then you may have some organizations where the position itself has virtually nothing to do with basketball and with the actual day-to-day, what's taking place on the court, or baseball, football, whatever. I mean, it becomes a money job. And one piece of this that I've always found sort of fascinating is speaking at length about what the actual job is. And I do believe that the insulation, I think that the insulation of these positions is mirroring what's happening in the country. There's no doubt in my mind. Just like I think that we'll be talking about the number of companies that are suddenly, that are suddenly unionizing. I mean, all of this is its own battle. Like, for example, I think that HarperCollins, the editorial assistants, have already authorized a strike date. We've already seen it happen with Amazon. We've seen it happen with Starbucks. We've seen the rise of unionization happening at the same time. We have this same isolation, or the way that these general managers and the way that these top positions are distancing themselves. At the same time, you're starting to see the labor battle trying to bridge that space. So this is happening across the board.
Yeah, I think just Howard, I was reading this article last night, like a New Yorker article about the huge upswing in sales of yachts, super yachts, and giga yachts, which this isn't exactly right, but a giga yacht being like a yacht longer than 283 feet or whatever the specificity is. And that in the last year, super yachts were doubled in sales. And now we have, for various reasons, because it's basically the last remaining place where you can really distinguish yourself as like, fuck you money, is by having a yacht. And you can have a level of service on a yacht that really wouldn't be respectable in everyday life. You couldn't have 53 servants at your home and really be it's still a functioning member of society. But on your yacht, you actually can have 7 people working for every guest that's on it. But I digress there. But my point being that part of the article was talking about how the number of billionaires who can afford these yachts, has gone up whatever tenfold, and yet the actual what is the term when? Oh, sorry. Okay, 3, 2, 1. Whereas the actual minimum wage has only gone up 20% in the last 20 years. So I don't know I know that's directly related, Howard, to what you were saying about like this escalating gap. Do you think that is existing within the way the general managers are trying to align themselves more on the higher end of the work structure of a franchise, being closer with the owner than they are with the on-court product?
Well, it's weird because compensation is the only place where it still is upside down. Coaches are still, on average, higher compensated per year than the people who employ them. And the same is true as you go down the list. Like, your associate head coach is going to get paid a lot more than what your assistant GM is making. Your assistant coaches get paid vastly more than what most of your front office people get paid. So it is still kind of an upside down pyramid almost, where the people, the players are the highest paid, and then the people who are ostensibly their bosses get paid less than them, and the people who are their bosses get paid less than them, until you get back to the owner, who again makes more than everybody combined pretty much. So I don't know. But definitely the alignment with the money, right? In the same way that, what does your average congressman or senator make? Their salary on the books is actually quite modest, right? Comparative to the power that they wield.
That's right. The opportunity to make money, however, is very, very high.
Exactly. Because of their proximity to the money.
That's right. But
you'll see this a lot with front office people. Their salary is something, and then you'll see they got into some business venture that has nothing to do with the running of their team. Oh, by the way, the owner.
You mean like buying a soccer team? Like buying an ownership? Exactly.
Are you suggesting also that they are close to the strings of power where maybe they have early access to making better investments?
All of the above.
All of the above, exactly.
Yeah.
And I would also argue as well. I'm sorry, Kate, go ahead.
No, I was going to pivot, so go for it, Howard.
Yeah, I was going to also argue too that for all the things that we're talking about, there's one piece of this that is sort of immutable, and that is the accountability piece of it. There's no question that the job is shifting. There's no question that the job is more complicated. There's no question about any of those things. What there is certainly a conversation to be had is your distance, decision maker, from the end results of what you do. And those end results are getting further and further away from the people who are closest to power.
Howard, let me ask you this. Who is evaluating the evaluator?
That's right.
Right? There's only one person who evaluates the evaluator.
It's the owner.
And that's the owner. Now, if I ask you who's evaluating the middle manager, the coach, you have at least 2, if not more, 3 parties. The owner.
You could probably name 10 people.
Right? But 3 categories of people.
Yes.
Actually, man, I'm not going to court of public opinion aside.
You're not going to break apart the analytics department?
No,
because they fall under.
You have the owner, you have the chief decision maker, but also you have the players. And I think that's an important point of this, why coaches have such short lifespans versus management. Because the players, their interactions with management pretty much begin and end with how much did he pay me. As long as I'm paid and I'm not traded somewhere I don't want to be, that's the limit of my interaction.
See, and that's the other piece of this. I mean, that's really important. I don't know how quickly, and we're going to have this conversation over time in the other sports, because we really haven't talked about football at all. In hockey, when you're talking about the role of the coach, the GM, the analytics, all of it, but we are talking baseball and basketball. And in baseball, the issue with this, you're 100% right. Pay me my money, and then my agent is going to call your agent when we get upset. But in basketball analytics, I don't know if those front offices have become as meddling to the coach as they are in baseball.
Right.
But this is part of this conversation. It's not just pay me my money anymore when you're in baseball. The analytics departments and the general managers are actually making the decisions on the field now, and they're not answering to those either.
Right. But I would say that the player, the conduit with which that message is delivered to the players is not the analytics department. They don't get Poindexter to come down with his calculator and his pocket protector and say, well, actually, it says here that you're better off batting cleanup. Like, that's not happening. They're taking this dirty laundry and saying, here you go, manager. You tell him. You break it to him. And so from the player perspective, the point that I have the most interaction with, particularly vis-a-vis bad news, is this guy. And so, and the player, obviously being one of the loudest voices in the organization, has the opportunity to paint the manager / head coach in a light that is not forgiving to them, versus the interactions that they have upstairs are so limited. They're like, I don't know. Like, what was the last time a player said, man, we suck because that guy made the wrong trade or wrong draft? They don't think like that. They think, man, if coach had just put me in, man, if coach had just, that's how they think. And that's the result. The only time they have an animosity with upstairs is when they didn't pay me my money. That's the only time.
And then, exactly, then their option then is to leave.
Right.
Doesn't it seem like an added byproduct of like the fattening of front offices? And I guess I'm using a pejorative there. I guess what other word could be used?
No, it's what they're doing. They're getting bigger and bigger.
Yeah.
Is a sport or sports which have never been risk tolerant or particularly risk tolerant, despite what it seems like the sports industry should be. Every sport I've been involved with, Amin, I assume you would nod to this. Like, there's not a ton of appetite for risk that the fatter front offices get, the less adept they are going to be at pivoting and making quick moves, being nimble, taking risks, because there's a lot more to protect. I mean, I don't know how you all felt at ESPN, but it was impossible, despite what maybe John Skipper, when he was president, said and what people who were on shows or hosting shows wanted to be talking about. There was still the middle manager layer, maybe of producers, who was like, no, our topics are going to be LeBron. And you're like, but maybe we could introduce something new. But it was like, at the end of the day, those producers had to be slaves to ratings, and they didn't want to be risk.
That's right. There's a reason why every single show had the exact same lineup.
Right, because there wasn't an appetite for the risk of a ratings dive as you introduce a new storyline to the public. And I'm just wondering if, like, the fatter front offices get, the less risks franchises are going to take, even though they don't take a ton to begin with.
It's funny. We used to call that I like my pool, meaning I'm not going to make a decision that's going to jeopardize my mortgage or my kid's tuition or my car note.
That's right.
And risk mitigation is a big deal. It's a huge deal because that's part of why you want so much data. I want to mitigate risk as much as possible, but ultimately, sometimes the riskiest play is the only path to the success that you seek. The Toronto Raptors in 2018 traded away what many believed at the time to be the franchise's greatest player, DeMar DeRozan, a guy who loved being in Toronto and wanted to be there forever and had many years left on his deal, in exchange for Kawhi Leonard, who openly said, I don't want to go there. I want to go to one of the LA teams, and had 1 year left on his deal. Someone who would be following a process, right, like of risk mitigation, as many of these organizations do, would say, absolutely not. The risk is too high. You acquire the guy, he doesn't want to play, he sits out. Even if he plays, he's got 1 year left, he leaves. But Masai Ujiri and Bobby Webster said, no, this is worth the risk. And they ultimately proved to be right because they won a championship. Now, had they not won a championship, had they gone to the conference finals and lost, which was very likely because they were down 2-0 and down big in game 3 against Milwaukee before rattling off basically 4 wins in a row. Had none of the Warriors got hurt and they would have got annihilated, will we still look at them as these bright risk-taking people? No, because that's not how sports is. We play everything by the result. It's like the coach who says, let's go for it on 4th down. And if they make it, oh my God, what a genius. And if they don't, they should have punted, you blew the whole game. And there is guys in between.
And guys don't have.
Sorry, quickly, Howard. Or in 1972, when Gulf Western wanted The Godfather to be 2 hours long instead of 2:45 to 2:55 because they wanted more showings on every screen. And they were like, there's no way we can take the risk of putting out that long of a movie when the data is showing us it needs to be 2 hours. We can't take the risk that it's 2:50 and that people are going to love it. And no, so these things are mirrored.
And then Francis the greatest analogy in Meadowlarker history.
Exactly, that is a winner right there. And then and then the studio said, "There's no way you can have Al Pacino at Coppola." It was like, "I'm trying to win here."
Mm-hmm.
Isn't it phenomenal to me that the studio wanted Robert Redford or Ryan O'Neal to play Michael, and when you look at Michael, you've got to have dark hair to be. You've got to have that look. And they wanted a Northern Italian.
Michael Corleone couldn't be played by Robert Redford
or Ryan O'Neal.
Ryan, yeah.
God bless them.
You see what happens? Sometimes you can't give the studio what they want.
No.
And then Coppola wins. See, I was right. And now Godfather 2, of course, gets to be same length and is even more daring than the one before. But the point remains is that there is this labor tension between, what is the goal? What is the goal? And as long as the goal is something other than winning, then you're going to have these tensions because there are going to be enough people who will look at the end result and say, well, wait a minute. Why is it that all of your movies suck and you still have a job? Are you reading this Rolling Stone piece on DC and Warner Brothers right now?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness, right? Once again, it's a shit show. And in that case, it's like everybody's losing a job. Stakes too high.
That's a good place to end. Yeah.
Indeed. I was going to say, Kate Fagan, final thoughts? Amin, final thoughts? Or do we just leave it on this, hop on Rolling Stone, and just read the story of the DC universe and Warner Brothers, and you will thank all of us for the suggestion.
Final thought. Oftentimes that coach who proved management wrong ends up winning, is given too much power and ends up ruining it all. Godfather.
He ends up getting a 5-year contract, and then you get Godfather. But 18 years later,